is Shirley from Shirley's World, and I'm here with another ironing video. I'll try to think of some stories. Somebody said they wanted some nursing stories. I hope this camera is somewhat straight. My little GoPro is on a tripod with bendy legs, and it is wrapped around a clothes rack, so I just pray that it stays in this position. Yeah, I have lots to iron. A lot of very wrinkled linen items. But this one I'm going to start with is a Columbia men's fishing shirt, and it's that Omni Shade fabric. So I think it will iron easily. So I'm going to start here with the sleeves. They were rolled up, so they're really wrinkled. Let's see. Have steam. I don't want to tell my Halloween stories about when I was nursing, a nurse in the ER, till more like Halloween. But yeah, there's plenty of stories. I worked in the ER. First of all, I worked up on the floors in the hospital. I started actually when my kids were tiny, and I worked in pediatrics. And I think I just had my son at the time, and then I got pregnant with my daughter, and after she was born, I'm not sure if I went back to peds or if I decided to go to a regular med-surg floor, they used to call them. But anyway, when I worked in pediatrics, I really loved working there. And I found out when you work in pediatrics, now you have to, this is a long time ago, okay? Things have changed so much in hospitals. Nursing has changed. It's altogether different now. We actually did patient care back then, the RNs too. And yeah, we were assigned so many rooms or so many patients, depending on how sick they were. And I learned a lot in pediatrics, especially for taking care of my own children. It was a good place to work. So if something happened with your own kids, you sort of knew how to deal with it. I learned how to give medicine easily to tiny little kids and tiny little babies. How you hold them and how, you know, you give oral medicines. That was helpful. Yeah, I learned that actually back then there was visiting hours, even for the patient, even for the parents. Parents didn't stay overnight with kids back then. I suppose they could have gotten special permission, but pretty much there were just regular visiting hours. And, you know, the kids always behaved better after the parents had left than when the parents were with them. We always talked about that. But these were kids that weren't super sick, okay? Now, back when I was a nurse, this was in the 60s when I was in pediatrics. So, I always remember how I picked my pediatrician. when you're a nurse, it's easy to pick a good doctor because you're working with them. So when I was in pediatrics, how I decided what pediatrician that I really wanted was with working with them. And there was one particular doctor I remember. This is back when meningitis was still so dangerous. Bacterial meningitis. Little babies would have it, little kids would have it, and this was like, they could easily die from this. This is before vaccines for it, and yeah. And what made me pick my pediatrician back then was there was a baby that was really sick with meningitis. And this doctor stayed with this baby, sat with this baby all night. I was on the night shift. And he sat there and spent the entire night with this baby. And this baby did recover. But that was a scary, scary disease back then. Anyway. A lot of nurses went to this doctor that I picked. They were a group of 3. Yeah, 3 pediatricians. And they were very good. A lot of nurses went to them. After I had my kids, I decided to, after my maternity leave, which back then it wasn't as long a maternity leave as you get now, I think. And the men, the husbands, I don't think got like what they call family leave now. Now the husband also gets to be off with their children or with their new child. But back then, no. So I went back to work, and I decided to go back to one of the med-surg floors. And my girlfriend, Becky, my best friend, was working with me up on the surgical floors. And she had gone down, she got a chance to go down to the emergency room and work. Well, after she was down there a few months, she told me, you have to come down here. Conditions are better. It's much more fun and exciting. So at the time there were no openings, so I put my name in to be able to go down and work in the ER instead of the med-surg floor, because I don't know, it was there were a lot of it was mostly medical patients. The floors back then weren't so specialized as now. It was just a medical and surgical floor, and there wasn't that much going on, to tell you the truth. So I put my name in, and finally got called to go down there. So I went down and started working in the emergency room. And yes, I liked it much better. But there are some exciting things that happened. One time, one thing I remember, Becky and I were working. She was working a different shift, though. She was working nights. I was working either days or evenings. And it was at night. I was home asleep. It was like 2 in the morning. And I got a call at 2 in the morning, and it was Becky. And she was whispering, and she said, somebody's been shot in the emergency room. I said, what? She said, I guess a man came in. His wife was a patient, had been brought into the emergency room, and the husband came in and came back and shot her. Now, I don't remember if she died or not, but he shot her right there in the emergency room. And of course, he was apprehended immediately. But the police were there and everything when Becky called me, but she wanted me to be the first to hear. So yeah, I'm sort of glad I wasn't on that night. But I think the cop that she was dating at the time was one of the men, of the cops that were working this case. So anyway, another thing, when I was working, I was in triage. Let me hang this up. I was out in triage, which was right out by the lobby where the people are waiting to be seen. And a nurse had to be picked from whoever was on that night or that day, had to be picked to be a triage nurse, and you'd sit out there and triage patients as they came in. So I was the triage nurse, and all of a sudden, a car comes zooming up to the doorway. There was a big circular driveway, not where the ambulance came in. That was another door, but where patients would walk in. Big circular driveway. This car came zooming up, and the doors opened, and these hysterical women, there had to be 3 or 4 women come in, and they're screaming and crying and wailing and speaking another language that we didn't understand. But we got the idea that somebody was hurt in the car. Well, this man had been shot. He had been shot in the back of the head, and he was dead. They had tried to get him out of the car, so he was like hanging out of the car. It was like a movie. It was like a hit thing. So the doctor went right out, and to make sure he wasn't alive, he was dead, and he pronounced him there. But this was a crime scene, so the police were called right away. And this was kind of scary because you didn't know if somebody in that car shot him and who had the gun, and maybe it was if somebody from out another car. I don't know. I never did hear what happened, but it was like, yes, it was just like in the movies. Yeah, we were nervous that whole evening working there because you never knew what was going on. And this was in a nice area. I worked in the suburb where I lived. And this wasn't inner city or anything. This was way before you heard about guns and, gangs or you didn't hear anything like that back then. This was something that never happened, that you'd never hear about. So that was a very exciting evening that we had in the ER. There were certain doctors that would come into the ER for emergency cases. I think 2 in particular that the nurses, all of us, hated to work with. Mostly because they were just mean. They were mean and condescending, and they just thought they were God, They were horrible to work with, and they would yell at you instead of talk to you. One was an ENT doctor. I doubt if he's still in practice or if he's even alive anymore. His name was Dr. Smith, and that was his real name. He was an ENT guy. He was horrible to work with. He would throw trays of instruments at the nurses. I mean, ridiculous. Just ridiculous. There was one nurse that we worked with, and she worked nights a lot of times, but she was just a short, really feisty little nurse, and she had been working there a long, long time. And she would go in with him all the time because she just said, let him throw something at me. I'll never have to work another day in my life. So, yeah. The other doctor was a chest surgeon. What do they call? Not a cardiologist, but that word has left me now, like many do. Yeah, he specialized in the lungs, if you know what I mean. So we dreaded, this is another thing we dreaded somebody coming in with a collapsed lung, because he is the one that was always called, especially if he was the one on duty. There was always a specialist. They would have to take their time to be on duty for the ER. Even though they had their own practices, they still had to, if they belonged to that hospital, they had to put in their time. I don't know, it wasn't, once a month or whatever it was. But if he was the pulmonary specialist that was on duty, or was to be called for any bad problem, we just dreaded anything coming in that had to do with an emergency, like a collapsed lung or something. So, or a car accident with something wrong with the lungs. So he was another one. I remember he was short, and I don't think he's still alive anymore. His name was Dr. Paris. Anybody that worked at that time will know exactly who I mean. And he was terrible to the nurses. He yelled. You had to be like a specialist. He was used to working with his own nurses, and he didn't have his own nurses down there. This camera looks so crooked. Are you pointing at me? Okay, sorry. Yeah, well, he got to like, if she happened to be on, her name was Lisa. She was just little, and she was really pretty, of course, and he liked to work with her. You know what I mean? Yeah. But you had to do everything perfect or you got yelled at, and that was just devastating in the ER. But those two doctors are the ones that come to mind that were horrible to work with. In the ER, the ER doctors that we had down there, we never had one that I didn't like to work with. We had an old grouchy guy. His name was Dr. Harold. I loved him. He only spoke when he had to. And, yeah, he looked grouchy. He was always, he only talked when he had to. But I remember, he loved animals. I'll tell you that. He loved animals. And he worked nights a lot. I don't know if he chose to work nights because he didn't have to talk to as many people. But when I worked nights with him, I remember one time I had a picture of my cat's x-ray of my cat's lungs. I don't know what cat it was. It was a long time ago. But for some reason, I asked the vet if I could have that. It was back when you actually had film, that you could hold up in front of that light box. And we had somebody come in that had some sort of x-rays. It didn't necessarily have to be lungs, but or ribs. But we could put x-rays up, the x-ray department would bring x-rays over and put them up that the doctor could look at them right there in the ER. So one time he went to look at some x-rays, and I had put the x-rays of my cat up there. And he looked at them. He knew exactly what it was. And he says, "All right, who did this?" And, I just said, it was me. I think he actually laughed. But I really loved working with him. He had been a recovering alcoholic, Dr. Harold. And if there was an alcoholic came into the ER, or somebody had been drinking a lot and was in an accident or something to do with alcohol, he would have us put him in a private room, and he would go in and sit down with them and talk to them. And yeah, he was really good that way. And he would give them all kinds of numbers in order, to call Alcoholics Anonymous and all this stuff. He worked with them. But yeah, after I retired, it was a number of years, and then I found out he had died, and I was so upset that somebody hadn't told me about that. But anyway, there was a lot of strange and funny things happening to the ER. Of course, you had to have those in order to, sort of balance the tragedy that came in. There were, of course, lots of tragedies, but there were fun things too. I just got this blouse down. Look how wrinkled these things are. Yeah, I think this is right before actually I retired. I had worked almost 20 years, most of them more than 20 years, but most of them in the ER. If you don't count, I didn't even count the ones in pediatrics because that was sort of pre-kids. But I remember this little old man came in. He was little and skinny, and I have to put more water in here. He wasn't in danger of dying or anything, but he had all these they were stab wounds actually, but they were just tiny little marks. I mean, the penetration was so minimal, but he had them all over his chest and his stomach, and he was trying to kill himself, stabbing himself to death because his wife had died. And I think he was up in his 80s, and I don't remember what she died of, but she had died and he was alone. Yeah, and that just, I don't know. I always had a soft spot in my heart for little old men in the ER. I have to put some water. More water. I'm running out of steam here. They did give you a cup to fill this with, but I don't know where that is, of course. Sometimes I overfill it and it comes gushing out the top. So I try not to do that. Anyway, like I said, most of the time in the ER was, we had fun times. The nurses, we all became pretty close. Uh, there wasn't any arguing or things like that. I mean, blatant arguing. There were people that I think were jealous of other nurses, but it wasn't anything big. But like I said, my girlfriend worked there with me, and she finally went and she decided that she wanted to try being like a visiting nurse. So she quit the ER, or went into another field. She went in the field of visiting, like going to people's homes and taking care of them. And I don't know, I don't remember how long I stayed after that, but I got pretty burned out at the end. And then my husband, Jack, I was married to him then at the time. And that's what I said, our wedding, when we had our wedding, it was all police and nurses at the wedding, at the reception. So the alcohol bill was tremendous because we had an open bar. But anyway, after she left, I didn't stay that much longer. I got just burned out at the end. And finally just up and... The reason I really quit was because my husband, when he had been with the police department over 25 years, and when he turned, I think it was 45, when he turned 45, ouch, they made a rule. I don't know if it was in the police department. I don't know with what this rule was. You could retire with a full pension. Must have been with the city. You could retire with a full pension at, it was either 45 or 48, and he had just reached that age, and he had his 25 years in. So he said, they made this rule just for me. And he retired from the police department. The real reason being that his whole career, there was one chief who all the police hated. This chief of police, his name was Sabo. This police chief, long before had reached his time of retirement, but he stayed because he just enjoyed the power. This is the type of person he was. And Jack would have been probably the next chief of police. He was a captain at the time. He was super smart. He could beat anybody on any of the tests that you have to take to go up in rank. So he would have probably been the next chief, but he didn't think he'd ever get a chance. He didn't think this guy would ever quit. So he retired. And when he retired, I decided I should retire. I got burned out, and I just, So at the time, I had cut down anyway to part-time. I was just working at, was sort of part-time. I was working 3 10-hour shifts. So 30 hours I was working. And so I retired too. And that's why we got to do a lot of the things that we got to do. Sorry about that. It's just advertising, whatever they call them. So I didn't even answer. I don't answer phone calls that I don't recognize who they are from. So, yeah, so I retired. He retired. He didn't stay retired very long, however, because they called him back. He couldn't stand to be retired, actually. He went back and worked part-time for the city with his friend Jack, another Jack, as a housing inspector. It wasn't housing, it wasn't houses, it was some sort of inspector. He always called it the sidewalk inspector. That's not the name it was something else. But yeah, he worked a short time doing that, and then it was only part-time. And then they called him back into the police department, because they had just built a jail, a brand new jail, justice center. It was a brand new justice center, and they called him back to write the all the rules and the whole book. That was what he was good at. He could write, I forget what it was called, but the manual. He wrote the whole manual for the Justice Center. And not only did he write it, I typed it into the computer. So he'd come home and he'd write it while he was at home too. And they'd give me sheets of paper. He'd write it longhand. He was not a computer guy. He'd write it longhand, and I'd type it into the computer and print it out, and he'd take it in the next day, and I don't know, it had to be okayed by somebody, I don't know, the mayor or somebody, or the chief. And yeah, so we were doing that all the time for a while. Well, then, when the Justice Center opened, he was called back to be the warden of the jail. So he worked as the warden of the jail, and I think he went back full-time for a while. And then he was diagnosed with leukemia, and he retired. So I don't want to end on that sad note. But yeah, that was a very hard time then. He lived, they gave him 5 years, he lived 3. And he was at the Cleveland Clinic, so this blouse has a real, lots of strings there I have to cut off. Yeah, so those are some of my stories. There's more stories of when I was nursing up on the floors. I'd love to tell you the one that I don't think I can. I don't know if you're supposed to call that ethnic group gypsies anymore. If you're allowed to do that, I don't know. I have to look that up because I have a big story about that. A couple stories. But anyway, I'm going to stop this video because it's getting pretty long. And I have to tell you, I will do a video pretty soon, maybe today. I may be doing videos all day. I may do the video today. Samantha and I got the photography station changed. It is now downstairs, and I want to show you. I want to show it to you. So I may do that video today too. So thank you for watching. This has to have a lot of editing done. So I'll be busy editing before this ever goes up. But I hope you enjoyed a few of the stories I had. And I will see you in the next one.